Hi. Well, here we are at China X office hours again. And in this case, since I was involved in this week's course, Ted Hui is going to take the lead on this. So Ted, where are we?
So this week we are doing the Yingying story, and a lot of students find this very interesting. So some learners express that they love the classroom discussion you have with a lot of Harvard students, especially that format. It is great to see the opinions of Harvard undergraduates, and as well as you lead. And I think Professor Kirby's there comment on other students. It's also wonderful, and then reading Yingying story like a couple of times together with other students, it's very fruitful for them. So some learners also express interest in having more units with you and hope that you could introduce other tongue tells.
Well, part of the goal in China X Humanities was, in fact, that we would move through a series of topics rather than get caught up only on one. Perhaps for the future we can think about a longer set of units on Tang literature, but we'll have to see.
So next unit, we also have Professor Bo Yu leading us to read a few new Confucianism.
Next week, next unit, that's right.
So
that's right.
I know, Professor Bo, you have been interested in intellectual history for a long time already.
Right.
So why are you interested in Chinese intellectual history?
Okay, so let me explain it like this. The intellectual history for me is not the history of philosophy, but it's the history of the ways shared values change over time. Which doesn't mean that everybody shares the same values, but that there are various dominant modes and streams, a landscape of values, so to speak, and that changes over time, and how do we account for that change? But the reason I got interested in that whole issue was it seemed to me, well, it really began when I was a student in Taiwan and studied the Confucian classics for a number of years with an old master. Myself and a number of Chinese students and some other foreign students, was to realize that people saw the world through a certain lens, and thus they responded to the world based on how they saw it. And what was the lens? In other words, how does culture form the way in which we see the problems in the world and in which we view our possible responses? And it seemed to me that if we wanted to understand Chinese history, we needed first to understand how did people understand the world and what did they think their choices were. And that's why I studied intellectual history.
I see. So moving forward, what would you expect? I mean, what research are you interested in pursuing?
Well, so I'm interested in a number of things. One, the long-standing project on local cultural history. How do we understand the notion of locality and the way in which intellectual culture is perpetuated at the local level, particularly once the civil service examinations arise. But the other thing I'm very interested in is intellectual debate in China today and the different schools of thought, in part because we have not only socialism, but we also have a resurgence of Confucianism. There are proponents of civil society. There are people who are the postmodernists. There are the national learning people. There are the neoliberals, the neo-authoritarians, the nationalists. It's quite a mix, and it's very, very interesting.
And so I know that you have an interview with Professor Wang Hui from Department of Chinese Language and Literature in Tsinghua University about his book project from
which
the Song Dynasty.
The rise of modern Chinese thought, which for him begins in the Song Dynasty, begins with the issues we'll be talking about in our next unit. That's right.
So we will have a link in the resource tabs to link our learners to that interview. So let us jump to the feedback. I mean, there are a couple of comments we got from this module about Yingying story. So Tim did some research in his comments on the discussion forum on the Romance of the Western Wing, Xixiangji, which is a play penned by Wang Shifu in the Yuan Dynasty. So he thought that both the version we have, the Yingying story in the Tang and the Western Wing romance, both have pleasing attributes and both should be considered within their own time frame. And I think what is interesting is that he thinks that it would be wrong to try to determine which version is better, especially there's a historical framework behind it. So for many people, especially in modern times, a softer or kinder story might be, preferable. So what do you think?
Let me, since you specialize in Yuan and Ming literature, let me ask you a question. Wang Shifu's version and the version that appears in late Ming, Xixiangji, are they basically the same?
Not necessary.
Not necessarily.
So there is different versions. So there is a play version which ends with Zhang Sheng, Scholar Zhang, dreaming of the dreaming of Ying Ying, and the narrative stops there.
I see.
So there's no, it's very ambiguous. There is no like a happy ending or a sad ending.
But he's dreaming of, he wants a happy ending.
He wants a happy ending.
And then there's the version with a real happy ending.
Yeah, right? So we do have the Wang Shifu version. So there are like different versions.
And in fact, there's that Wang Shifu version begins in the Sung. We actually have a record from the Sung dynasty which tells the story again, or parts of it, but gives the happy ending already in the Sung. So I think Tim's right. I think he's right. But I guess what I would say would be something slightly different, that you're right that we can't judge which is better or worse. They need to be seen in context. But the key, I think, is that we have to understand that there was this change. In other words, that people's values changed in such a way that Zhang Sheng's, Scholar Zhang's own, what happened in the Tang Dynasty was no longer acceptable. Yeah. And so there must be a change away from the individual as being defined by their public role to the individual as having their own personal nature, their own set of desires and values. And the other thing I think that must have happened is that the passions or love is getting reevaluated, right? Yeah. Away from a Buddhist point of view.
So there is like an interest in emotions, but how to configure it within their...
So the Buddhists had typically said that the emotions were an impediment to enlightenment. Yep. And as we'll see in our next unit, the Neo-Confucians come along and say, without the emotions, you can't interact with the world.
So this actually, ties back to a lot of the themes of our previous modules.
That's right. That's right.
And I think it's very interesting. Portia also have like a response to that. So she thinks that today chances are big that one gets tired of this love, no matter for what reason. So leaves the other one heartbroken behind. So this was more of a real life story if it's a sad ending. So that's her take.
So it's interesting, Portia says, well, a sad ending then, but in fact, in the Tang story, it's not regarded as sad.
Yeah. I mean,
and I don't know if I was a Tang reader, do I regard it as sad? Or I say to myself, he saved himself. I mean, what's my, I can't imagine myself as a Tang reader.
It's a little bit hard to jump back and think about how they would read it and how they would respond to it, right? But the interesting thing is that, the very fact that you write a story about that and let it circulate among like other literati friends, that itself somehow tells us that it seems for the author himself, it's quite appropriate to have that.
Yeah. Clearly, the author thinks it's appropriate. Yeah. But that gets us, of course, to the question of circulation. Which we can talk about.
Yeah. So also, she draws our attention to some contemporary lyrics. So the Greek's lyrics, "Tell me more, tell me more." Did we get very far?
Unfortunately, I don't know the song. I have no clue what she's talking about. So, Portia, send us an email. Tell us.
So also, we have like Jenny's response to it. So she thinks that this is a story about passion, about expectation, about how human messes with an orderly life. And I think it ties with a very good comment made by Fedimina, which is also about human ritual, passion, how to configure that into what we have, like in the previous modules. Say, Professor Pewitt tells us that Confucius would imagine that human is a bunch of masses that we have. We are playing out patterns.
The messy
self.
Content of the self.
Yeah. So, how would you think? To view the story in a Confucian point of view. Given that Confucian point of view itself might, cover a lot of ground.
So I'm not sure that we should be speaking of it so much in a Confucian point of view unless we know which Confucian point of view we're talking about. So we could say in Michael Pewitt's view of Confucianism, this seems to fit better
Yeah.
In the later imperial Neo-Confucianism view, this story doesn't fit. That's why they changed the ending.
Yeah.
Right? But I want to go back to what Jenny said, because she changed her response over the course of the weekend. So actually I looked in on the China X Facebook group, and Jenny had been writing some things, and I responded to them as well. And she thought further, and she ended up with this very thoughtful comment on as a story of passion, of expectation, of the way in which being human messes with orderly life. I think that's right. The one thing I want to add to this is that this is a story about passions and the challenges they create for us as public people. Nowadays, there's been a lot of discussion about sexual abuse, sexual predation, things like this, and so that's the dark and dismal side of this. The passions, the desires are a problem, right? And this story is working that out. Both the tremendous excitement of them and a sense of the dangers of them. But the other thing I'd say about this story, and I think it's really important for us all, is that thinking about it and being willing to change our minds is fundamental to learning. Yeah. But also, you need to connect this story back to the previous unit on Tang poetry, because the literary aspect of this, the fact that it's an exchange of letters, exchange of poems, that it's a story itself, and there's stories within the stories, so to speak. This is very much a literary work, and the presumed author, Yuan Zhen, was one of the great literary figures of his time, one of the 2 or 3 greatest literary figures of his time. And I think that in some sense, the notion of the literary is the outside stuff that's shown to the world, right? And but it connects to what's inside. Yeah. And so it's the way we appear is part of the literary, whether we put on makeup or not, the way we write the poem, the letter we write. And these are all articulations of things that are in us, but things we can't always fully express. And so that connection between public life, literary appearances, and desire, emotions, passions, that's such an interesting connection. Yeah. And I think in this sense that Fedemina gets it just right. It's the problem of ritual and passion, the way in which Buddhism denies the value of emotions, that these are all things that come into play.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, it actually helps me to think about like the role of literature here, right? I mean, because it's connecting. It's really a venue for people to work out, I mean, their questions, like questions about emotions, questions about desire. And I think it's really interesting because it's not purely about playing a role, but it's not solely about self. It's in between. Right. And I think that is the interesting thing about it.
Yeah. You know, somebody asked, I think, I saw in your notes from what learners were writing that they wondered what Confucius would say.
Would say, yeah.
And I do not speak for him. I don't know what he would say, except that I think that the whole question of the sexual in literature, bringing it into literature, and to what extent that's acceptable or not, is an issue. So this story is a little bit exceptional in Tang, right? And we have some other stories that have sexual content. When we get into Sung, almost nothing, right? Or it's elusive at best. But then when you get into the 17th century, you see the appearance of pornography.
Indeed.
And which is another big question for us. Why does pornography, both in writing and in painting, spread? So
I think it's a very interesting question, and we probably can we would probably go back to that, like, I mean, later in our course to think about that.
We should ask Professor Li Wai when she comes.
About novels and
right.
Because there are a lot of pornographic novels or erotica in the 17th century.
Yes,
so
indeed.
It's probably a question that we would want to answer. So a lot of learners are interested in the social context of how these poems and how these narratives are circulating in the Tang Dynasty. So one thing that we encourage learners to do is to refer back to China X Part 3, Cosmopolitan Tang, Aristocratic Culture. And Also, we have a lot of learners expressing interest in the Facebook group. So I know that you've answered Jenny's question in the Facebook group, but maybe we should also recap here to our learners in the edX platform so that they can join in the discussion.
Please do.
I'll play the role of Jenny here. So there are two questions, one about the circulation of the tales and the other about the literacy of female. So first, in what context would the story have been read at the time it was written? Would it have been circulated in a manner similar to poetry?
I think that's just right. It's circulated in a manner similar to poetry, and circulated in manuscript, and then copied. So, although printing is appearing during this time, I think all of us doubt that printing would have been used for this. Probably would have been a manuscript circulated and passed among friends, and say, "What a story!" And other people copy it out, and thus it circulates and survives.
Yeah.
On female literacy, my initial response is the story assumes that women in this family, the Tsui family, the Boling Tsui family, which is an aristocratic family, that they're literate. It just assumes it. It doesn't make an issue of it, it assumes it. But it assumes a certain kind of literacy, which is particularly the poetic. And I think if we had to generalize, we would generalize like this, that aristocratic families or families with a high level of education expect daughters to be highly literate, because they're going to marry boys from other families like that, and the mother of children is expected to be able to see that the children get an education. So they have to be literate.
Indeed.
Concubines maybe not, but certainly the wife.
Yeah, because in other tongue tales we do see that too. I mean, people, female reading poetry, talking about poetry. We do see that.
But it's also true, I think, that with some exceptions, and I think of Pan Zhao in the Han Dynasty, that women don't write about public affairs. And in fact, in the 17th century, when you see an explosion of writing, late 16th, 17th century, an explosion of writing by women, and the publication of anthologies of women's writing, the fact that some women were starting to write prose, which was regarded as being more official and politically oriented, caused some men to protest.
To be anxious. And I think we could also ask this question to Professor Lee too, because she has a book on women and national trauma in the in the late imperial China. So we could also think about that question later. So I want to remind our learners that our next unit has been opened. So it's about Neo-Confucianism.
It's going to have some elements of philosophy that are not readily apparent to us. It will be difficult, but I hope it will be interesting because it reflects a fundamental change in Confucian thought, and a change that will get written into the civil service examinations. And those will be required reading for everybody, or this new point of view will be the required reading for everybody who's preparing for the civil service examinations, which comes to more or less define the literate elite of China from the later imperial period, let's say from the 12th, 13th century on. And so it's, like it or not, it's actually really, really important for Chinese history. But it's also a new view of what it means to be a person, and a new view of the self, which you may or may not agree with. In any case, we were preparing to tape the office hours for the next unit, and I was looking forward to being here, but I've been suddenly called away. I have to go to China for a conference on education, and unless we change the taping date, I will have to leave it all up to you, Ted. We look forward to hearing from you, and I will certainly look forward to your comments. So thank you very much.